Hello, everybody. This is the recording of lecture 1, week 3 for LG139. And first of all, I'm going to recap what we did last week. And then we're going to move on to a new topic on the question of the role of scientific consensus in policy making. And then finally, I'm going to discuss the essay titles with you and give you some instructions around the essay. So to start with, let's just move on to the slide here. So last week, we talked about the work of Garrett Hardin and Elinor Ostrom. And the significance of this is that climate change is really best understood as a collective action problem. And with collective action problems, they're particularly challenging when we're dealing with certain classes of goods. So the kind of good we're concerned about are common pool resources, where it's difficult to enclose or fence off the good to prevent or exclude people from using it. We talked about the difference between private goods and public goods, the issue of free riding and what measures and theories various people have put forward to address the problem of free riding. Garrett Hardin, who was the author of the article Tragedy of the Commons, famously said that there was really no solution for these kind of problems except mutual coercion. And he didn't think that there was any reason to believe that a state entity, a leviathan, so to speak, that would be kind of managing everything from a distance, would be able to do that successfully. And mirroring his view of the Soviet experiment, he didn't think that would be acceptable. So the other alternative is privatizing the resource in some way, enclosing it so that it can be divided up into parcels of private property. Elinor Ostrom, on the other hand, believes that, and has plenty of examples of successful collective management of common pool resources. So as I said, we're going to go on then and talk about where science meets politics, and we're going to talk about the essay for later in this month. So to recap again, Hardin believes that the best way to deal with common pool resources, like the commons, the grazing commons in his article, is to divide it up and enter it into the system of private property rights. And this is based on the assumption that you're disrupting that tendency for us to, add more cattle to the commons to benefit ourselves, knowing that that will cause the commons as a whole to deteriorate gradually. But that principle wouldn't apply in the case of private property, that you would rationally use the resource and in such a way as not to over extract or overburden it. Now, of course, that's highly debatable, and there's not really much evidence in practice that privatizing a resource leads to its rational utilization in the long run, whatever about the short run. Now, Ostrom, on the other hand, believes, and as I said, had many, many examples that she researched over her career, but she found that individuals can build the institutional mechanisms, the rules, whereby they can jointly use a common resource and develop and administer their own effective form of governing and managing that resource. And for lots of small-scale resources, these methods are preferable to direct state management or privatization. However, it's not really clear that it would work in the case of a very global resource like oceans or the climate. And again, just to recap, Ostrom had 8 design principles for common pool resource institutions. So when she looked at all the different examples of successful regimes, they were all very different and they were very localized. Some of the mechanisms had been in place for hundreds, if not even thousands of years. But she could discern some common principles nonetheless that led to their success. And she was interested in the ones that worked for the long period of time, so long enduring common pool resource institutions. And she came up with these 8 principles. The first one is that the boundaries of the users and resources are clearly defined. Now, that might seem obvious, but it's about establishing what the resource is, where does it stop and start, and who's allowed to use it. And drawing up that kind of a list, it can be surprisingly challenging if it's left to people to do it themselves, as opposed to it being imposed upon them by some external or state, institution. The second principle is a compatibility between benefits and costs. And what she means here is that people understand the benefit of cooperation. There's clearly going to be some kind of cost to maintaining the system. It needs to be enforced. There might be administration, but that the benefits override any costs. Third, collective choice arrangements. This is just the principle of voluntary engagement in the process. So people aren't doing this because they have to. They're doing it because they believe it's in their interest to do so, and it makes sense, and they cooperate willingly. So it's a collective choice arrangement, and it's not being imposed on them by anybody. Fourth, monitoring. So no set of rules for managing a common pool resource can succeed unless there is monitoring. You have to be able to see if it's working and see where problems are arising, see if there's free riding or defection or people breaking the rules. Otherwise, clearly the system isn't going to work. And that leads on to principle 5, graduated sanctions. So what she found in her research was that where people were found to be infringing the rules, it seemed to work best if the sanctions started out relatively small and then grew if there was subsequent infringements, so that you weren't being excessively penalized for one breach, because maybe in a particular local context there might be some reasons for that. So graduated sanctions as opposed to strict penalties from the get-go. 6, conflict resolution mechanisms. With any of these kind of structures, there needs to be a built-in mechanism to deal with new information, conflicts, and possibly revising and updating the rules as time goes on. Because these common pool resources, if you think of examples like fisheries or timber or anything else, they're subject to the vagaries of nature. Sometimes there's good years, sometimes there's bad years. So there needs to be a mechanism to resolve any tensions and conflicts that might arise. And the 7th principle is really the minimal recognition of rights to organize. Now, this is the idea that people have the right to organize the resource in this way, that there is nothing prohibiting them from doing this. Because if there was a state law, for example, that prohibited these types of institutions from being developed to manage a local resource like a fishery, that could prove to be an obstacle to the durability of the CPR system. And finally, for common pool resources that are part of larger systems, they tend to be embedded in market structures. So if you think about maybe a fisheries example, it may well be that while the fisheries themselves are managed by a local CPR institution, it may well be that it sits inside a larger structure of fisheries co-op or some sort of market-based structure that sells the fish onwards to markets. So with larger CPRs, it's important to see it as something that sits inside a bigger structure. Excuse me. So moving on then to the second topic, which is the role of science in policy making. Now, this is something of a jump away from what we were talking about last week. And it's an interesting topic to jump to, because obviously scientific information is so important in establishing the scale of climate change as a problem and telling us what's going on and justifying the various policies that will have to be taken. But it's taken up an enormous amount of the public debate on climate change over the last 30 and even 40 years. So I think to start with, it would be useful to point you to the chapter, I think it's chapter 9 in the book here, Contemporary Climate Change Debates. It's available as an ebook in the library, but I think I posted up the entire PDF for you in Loop. And there's an interesting debate there between two of the main researchers that are, the papers are also in your Loop week 3 file. So essentially, this issue comes about because of the way in which what was perceived to be a lack of scientific consensus was used as leverage by the fossil fuel industry to undermine public support for climate action. So in response to that, a number of researchers went through all the scientific papers that have been published about climate change, is trying to establish the physical science basis of climate change. And they found that 97.1% of the scientific papers expressed a position on anthropogenic global warming, either explicitly state or imply that humans cause warming. So in other words, they thought it was a useful exercise to go through everything and try to add up all the scientists that agreed in the principle that humans were causing climate change. And the reason for this was because there was a perception put about in the media, driven by the fossil fuel industry and various other interests, that if you could sow doubt that there was a consensus, a scientific consensus, you would undermine the public support for any of the actions. Basically, you were encouraging, touching the pause button on climate action. So in reality, only 13% of the US public were aware that such a consensus existed. When they were surveyed, the average person really believed that the science wasn't settled. So the fossil fuel industry, its lobbyists and strategists, including people in the Republican Party and designing strategies for the Republican Party, sowed doubt in the public that climate change was real and that humans were responsible for it and that burning fossil fuels was the main culprit. So they put the message out that climate science wasn't settled and therefore extreme measures were not justified. So the point about this particular topic is, well, if we can then establish that there is a scientific consensus, is that going to be enough to justify or to mobilize public support for the policies that are needed? And that leads us to the debate here between Pearce et al. And Cook et al. So just to recap a little bit, the role of science in policy making is probably very important across a number of areas, but nothing like the climate change topic. First of all, the scientific information and research defines and measures the scope and scale of the problem. And it also increasingly has been assessing the level of risk and harm associated with the problem. So, for example, the SR15 report, which is the IPCC report into the global warming associated with 1.5 degrees, and that was published in 2018, assessed the level of risk and harm associated with 1.5 degrees of warming, because the previous IPCC reports had really only looked at the impact of 2 degrees. And they found that 1.5 degrees of warming was already very serious, and that we couldn't just aim for 2 degrees and accept that as an acceptable risk. That even 1.5 degrees of warming was extremely dangerous. And that really shifted the sort of, I suppose, the pressure on the political system to deliver much faster action than had been the case, because it narrowed the window of opportunity for addressing climate change, because all of a sudden we're going for a much kind of near-term target of holding warming below 1.5 degrees instead of 2. Importantly, the scientific information also assesses within certain statistical parameters the likelihood, of course, of events. So there can never be certainty when you're looking into the future, but the probabilities are very important in calculating, the costs and benefits of certain actions. For example, if you believe that you're going to have 100-year storms suddenly happening much more frequently, say 5 times more frequently, then you would be able to justify investing in various climate adaptation measures that would protect infrastructure, for example. So science also helps us understand the role of climate change in a wider systemic context. So, for example, the scientific research isn't just about the impact of global warming on surface temperatures. It also helps us understand the relationships of different drivers in Earth system dynamics. For example, the relationship between the Greenland ice sheet and ocean currents, the way that loss of Arctic ice means a loss of albedo, which drives global warming even further. And of course, the melting of permafrost can release more methane emissions. So there's lots of different parts to the climate system. And the science helps us join up all the bits into a kind of synthetic, complete narrative that is easier for policymakers to understand. But critically, it all comes together when there's a policy intervention that's needed. So the best example is probably the justification for smoking bans in public places. I mean, the scientific information had been there for a long time that, tobacco smoke was a leading driver of lung cancer and other health problems. And it was arising from a number of court cases, essentially, that it became clear that much more stringent public health interventions were justified to ban smoking in public places for public health reasons. So that couldn't have been done just on a whim, because the perception would be that you're interfering with people's rights or something and freedoms. So to act on climate change, we're going to have to do quite a lot of disruptive policy making. We have to leave almost all fossil fuels in the grounds. That's going to be hugely disruptive. So how are we going to get public support for measures to phase out fossil fuels? Well, the trouble with relying on this sort of consensus model, which is, saying, well, we need to phase out fossil fuels because there's a scientific consensus that says that humans are responsible for global warming. But the problem is that the authors, Pierce et al., in that article there, question the usefulness of studies that focus on consensus within the science community as the means to foster change in climate policy. For them, these types of studies, which demonstrate scientific consensus about the cause of climate change, distract from other efforts that would engage the public and bring about policy change. Rather than focusing on agreement about the human causes of climate change, they argue that it would be more beneficial to draw attention to a controversial policy issues whereby experts could play a facilitating role. So what Pierce and his colleagues are saying is that, just pointing to a consensus doesn't really, undo the need for deep debate about the controversial policies that are needed in a much more local context. And the consensus doesn't really mean very much in practice. So what he's saying is that appeals to the scientific agreements alone don't build the basis for policy action. It's unwise to assume that closing the consensus gap will influence public policy. Just because there's an expert consensus doesn't mean that scientific knowledge automatically translates directly into policy making and public affairs. It's a much more complicated process. Some issues make it into the policy stream and some issues don't. So what we need is to focus on the precise levels of the precise issues that are needed to drive policy forward. So what they're saying is focusing on precise levels of consensus doesn't tell us what to do about climate change. It just points to the fact that scientists are all in agreement about the source of the problem. So the effect of focusing on that is to depoliticize the issues and depoliticize the kind of choices that have to be made. For instance, you could say, without debating it politically, that the solution to all of climate change is to build all the nuclear power stations we possibly can over the next 20, 30, 40 years to replace fossil powered electricity. And without consulting people about the trade-offs, the costs, and the possible benefits of other options. So there is more than one solution to any of these problems, so people should be given a chance to debate them. And political conflict is not necessarily a bad thing in that sense. Just because there isn't agreement, that doesn't mean we can't get the public on board with specific policies. And in fact, debating the issues with disagreement at the core is often a really important way to build public understanding and appreciation for the problem. They also point out that values, morality, and judgment are also important levers to advance policy changes, as is linking climate change to local issues. In other words, if you want to try to persuade people that something should be done, we need to also point to the values and morality that, for example, if we don't take action on climate change, we are going to be bequeathing a very polluted and damaged Earth to the next generation, and that, we have duties to the next generation. We have duties to the future that need to be factored into our decision making. So when Cook replied to this particular argument, I think they make a number of very interesting points, because he says, in the response, it's just Cook by himself, that it's not a matter of either or. It's not one or the other. So the role of consensus is very important, because it's a stepping stone to discuss adaptation and mitigation policy options. It's not by itself the key thing that's going to deliver political support. He points to the way that the fossil fuel industry undermined public support by hammering home this incorrect point that the science wasn't settled. So his argument is that we kind of need to fight back, and we need to push the argument that there is a consensus. And if we don't address those misconceptions, we risk there being distractions to the substantive debates on policy options. So we have to just put that issue to bed. And the interesting thing is that if you look over, and I doubt you'll have time, all the media coverage of climate change over the last 15 years, I think Cook has been largely proven correct, actually, that it was necessary to put that issue to bed. And once the media were on board, they didn't anymore tolerate this kind of two-sided argument that you could have a debate between people who say, yes, there's climate change happening, and another side that says climate change is not happening, because those two positions are not the same. It's like having a debate between people who believe in gravity and people who don't. There might be people who don't believe in gravity, but they're talking through their hats. They're not representing reality. So it doesn't make sense to create this kind of false balance, this kind of, and that was a feature of the media debates about climate change for a long, long time, until the I suppose about 10 years ago, and even as recently as 5 years ago. And in some media stations, some media outlets still give airtime to climate deniers, but it's much less common now. And the reason it's much less common is because this issue has been, if you like, put to bed by the work of people like Cook. So he says that quantifying consensus is a way of tackling misinformation, which has been successfully used as a tactic to delay action. And also, he says that studies show that scientific consensus does influence other beliefs. People are quite inclined to believe in what experts tell them. And it's deference to authority, deference to expert opinion. So if you can establish that the expert opinion is all lined up in favor of one argument, this can be quite persuasive in the public. And he points out that studies that address scientific consensus are not meant to resolve policy questions. Their purpose is to address misconceptions that delay important policy debates. So he says, that, it's not the same thing as, using scientific consensus as an argument for a particular policy intervention. It's really more about creating the framework for those policy debates to happen in the first place. So there's quite a few readings up on Loop, the original article by Pierce, the response by Cook, the consensus handbook, and also the chapter from Hulme, which is chapter 9. And you will see now that that will be relevant to your essay. So going to the essay, so the first essay is going to be due on the 23rd of February at 5 o'clock. It represents 40% of your overall grade, so it's a big chunk of marks. It needs to be 2,000 words, excluding the bibliography. And there will be penalties if you exceed that, because it's just important to be quite disciplined about that. You're going to need to use Harvard-style referencing. And this is something that I will talk to you about on Thursday briefly, because my experience is that people don't do it correctly. And it's so much easier if you learn how to do it properly from the very beginning, and then it'll be easy peasy for the rest of your degree. But if you don't do it properly to start with, you'll end up continuing in some habits that will be hard to get rid of. So it's necessary to use in-text citation. You can use Zotero or EndNote or whatever other referencing tool you like. That won't matter. The important is that it's in the Harvard style. So if you aren't sure, the library has a Cite It Right guide, and you should follow that quite closely. And I still have to rely on those guides from time to time whenever, I'm looking for the rule as to how to cite a particular thing, a newspaper article or a YouTube video or something like that, so that you've got a clear guidance on how to do it properly. Having said that, I'm expecting that you will use peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters in the main. You can use reports, but they shouldn't be the basis of your argument. You really need to stick to the peer-reviewed articles that are on the syllabus, and not just go Googling and you'll find all kinds of irrelevant articles. So please don't do that. Please just use the material that's on Loop in the main. You'll have to submit it through Loop. That won't surprise you. Don't send it to me via email. Now, the two questions that I have, one is on the first topic we did, the Harden and Ostrom, and the second one is on this scientific consensus. So question 1, picture a pasture open to all. It is to be expected that each herdsman will try to keep as many cattle as possible on the commons. Discuss this statement with respect to the case of global climate change. So you don't have to stick rigidly to that particular quote. You can, use the whole article and Harden's argument as it applies to climate change. And the second question is, scientific consensus does not necessarily beget policy progress. Discuss this statement with reference to the relationship between scientific knowledge and climate change policy making. So there's two questions for you. I'll go over them again on Thursday if you have any questions. So make sure to ask me on Thursday if you do. So again, as I mentioned, referencing and plagiarism, these are really important issues in university. We all rely on and draw from the ideas of others in academia, and that's absolutely no problem. But you have to give people credit for those ideas, and you can't just take other people's work, put them in your own words, and pass it off as your own. Even if you've changed the words a bit, you've taken out quotes and so on, that's still plagiarism. And putting it in inverted commas without referencing it correctly is also plagiarism. And it's a very serious issue in academia, and it can lead to very serious penalties. I've been on a number of review boards of students who, got caught plagiarizing, and the sanctions are quite serious in DCU. And the reason for that is because plagiarism is essentially a form of theft. It's dishonest. We saw recently that the president of a leading university in the United States was accused of not even plagiarism, but of not citing sources properly, and lost her job. Now, there might have been other things going on there as well, but the point is that it's extremely serious. So you need to adopt a consistent approach and a very rigorous and honest approach to citing. And don't be afraid to put things into your own words and talk, write the essay very much as if, you're writing it. You take responsibility for every sentence that's on the page. And when you draw from the work of other people, you cite them correctly. Cite every source every time you use it, and just get into the habit, and then it's not going to be an effort. Just a couple of tips around argumentation. So it's useful, first of all, you have to choose your topic, right? And then put together a bibliography. So make a list of the things you're going to need to read. We've got a starting list, obviously, on loop there with the readings. And you might like to read around the topic a bit more. But make sure that it's relevant to the essay. Don't just go Googling, because Google will bring you all kinds of answers that may not be good quality papers. You want to use papers that directly address the topic at hand. Use Google Scholar for any searches that you want to do of academic literature. And also use the bibliographies in those papers. Now, obviously the Harden one is from 1968, so that's not so useful. But look at a paper that's on the reading list that's more recent, more current, and then go to Google Scholar, or go to the bibliography of that paper rather, and look and see if there's any other papers that you think from that list would be useful for your essay. So put the bibliography together first, and then when you're happy that you've read the topic widely, before you start writing the essay, ask yourself, what's your argument? What's your point of view on this? What do you think? Do you agree with Harden that, there is no reason to be optimistic that people will behave altruistically, that human cooperation is going to be enough to resolve these common pool resources without mutual coercion, as he says? What have others said about this point, and contrasting points? So the debate between Cook and Pearce is quite interesting, because both of them are very persuasive. So when you read both of those pieces, it's sometimes hard to know which one you agree with. So maybe read somebody else's perspective on the debate, zooming out away from those two writers particularly. Make sure the sources you're drawing from support your argument. It's very easy to go and look for an article that seems to be on the topic that you're writing about, but very often they veer off in a different direction, and they're not necessarily addressing the core issue in the same way that you started out with. Paraphrase in a coherent way by putting the ideas into your own words while maintaining the spirit of what the authors wrote. And present your argument clearly. Simply stating that something is true or obvious does not make it so. So unlike the kind of essays that people write in school, when it's your opinion, you don't really, have to write it like, in my opinion, Cook is right because. That doesn't really work in academic essay writing. It's more important to be persuasive. Pick arguments, develop a set of reasons why Cook or Pearce or Harden or whatever are more persuasive. So avoid sliding into that kind of very, schooly kind of tone where you're saying, well, this is my opinion and therefore, take it or leave it. That's not going to be very persuasive. Some other tips: avoid long sentences and really avoid jargon. Use proper English grammar, keep your language concise and to the point, and maintain a formal language register. In other words, don't slide into slang, don't write the way we talk, use the formal language that you are now used to reading in academic style. Pay attention to punctuation. This is so important. There's no reason for sloppiness. You have various tools available to you in Microsoft Word that allow you to check for grammar and spelling, and there's just no reason ever to have grammar and spelling mistakes. Avoid abbreviations such as don't, won't, and shouldn't, so you write out the full word, and use either US or European English, but don't mix them up. So just have a consistent spelling. The difference there applies to words with S or Z in them, for example. And do not capitalize words at random. This is very common and it's very frustrating. And all of these things I will attempt to correct, so you will see it when you get your papers back. So please make an effort to just put the essay together properly with double-spaced and minimum size 12 font, please, just to make it easier for me to read. One thing to note is that we all get distracted, and when you have lots of assignments due, it can be hard to get going. So the best thing is to try to just start writing. Once you start writing, the process itself gives you clarity. You know, you might start thinking, I don't really know what my point of view is on this. So you could take a chunk of one of the articles that we've discussed and just summarize it for yourself, write it down. And as you write, very often you will find that opinions and points of view and questions and other ideas come to your mind. You don't necessarily need large blocks of time to produce an essay. It's often better to make consistent progress little by little. I have to confess, I'm a person who needs large blocks of time when I'm writing. I do it kind of all in one go. But that's a recipe for stress for many people. There are a few apps that can help you with this. Forest is one you're probably familiar with. There's also Freedom 2, which is a nice one because it blocks out all your social media and all the notifications for particular periods of time, allowing you to work. And those apps are really great because it's all the other little notifications that we get from phones and laptops that are our biggest distractions. So use those tools to help you, and you can set them for like 40 minutes or an hour and a half and just make yourself do a bit of that every day until the essay is done. And then just one final point about feedback. So when you get feedback on your essay, it won't be more than a paragraph, because there's about 55 students. It's quite a job to read all the essays. But the purpose of the feedback is to help you improve. So it's not intended to take you down or to make you feel bad. You're here to learn, and every aspect of your essay writing can be improved with time and effort. And it does take practice. Nobody writes brilliant essays from the get-go in university. It takes practice, and that's why you have so many essays to write. So don't take the feedback personally. It's not a personal comment at all. It's all part of the learning process. So I'm going to wrap up there now, and hopefully I'll be well enough to join you on Thursday, and we can have another look at the essay questions if you want before we move on to the next topic. I'm going to upload the readings for Thursday now when I get the chance, and please do as much of those as you can before we meet again, and thank you.